That sentence sounded normal when my mom said it. She didn't whisper it or dress it up with drama. She just said they couldn't afford 2 tickets for the vacation, like it was weather, like it was math, like it was already settled. I remember nodding without thinking, because trusting her felt automatic, almost physical. It didn't occur to me that it could be untrue. In our house, explanations didn't come with receipts, they came with authority. When she spoke, the conversation was already over, and I accepted that as part of being a good kid, the vacation itself wasn't some luxury escape, at least not on paper. It was framed as a simple break, something modest, something just barely within reach. That framing made the lie blend seamlessly into the background of everyday life. I watched my sister lay her clothes out on the bed, folding swimsuits and sundresses while I sat on the floor pretending to scroll my phone. I told myself it didn't hurt. I told myself being mature meant understanding sacrifice. I repeated that idea until it sounded like my own belief instead of something I was forcing myself to accept, even helped her pack. I zipped the suitcase. I reminded her about chargers. I smiled when she talked about how excited she was, nodding at the right moments like I was part of the experience too. I learned early that disappointment is easier to carry when you don't make noise about it. So I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why there was only 1 ticket instead of 2. I absorbed the explanation and folded it neatly inside myself, convincing myself this was what love looked like. At the time, it felt small. That's the part people don't understand. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic betrayal moment that demanded attention. It was quiet. It sat there. It waited. I grew up believing love often meant being the one who went without, the one who didn't complicate things or make situations harder. I believed that if I accepted less gracefully, it would somehow balance out later, like kindness stored in an invisible account. For years, I barely talked about this. When I did, I framed it like a harmless family anecdote, something slightly unfair but not worth unpacking. I laughed it off. I minimized it. Admitting how deeply I believed that explanation felt embarrassing, like confessing I'd fallen for a trick everyone else could see. So I buried it under jokes, logic, and the idea that parents always know best, even when something feels off. What I didn't know then was that the truth wasn't hiding in the vacation photos or the souvenirs they brought home. It didn't announce itself immediately or demand confrontation. It came back with them quietly, tucked into offhand comments and changed behavior. Something felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain yet. Once I noticed that feeling, I couldn't unnotice it. That was the moment everything started to unravel. In our family, I was the reliable one. I didn't announce my needs or ask for upgrades. I learned early that praise came from being low maintenance, from not adding weight to already heavy conversations. If something needed to be done quietly, it usually landed with me. I became good at reading rooms, adjusting myself, and shrinking expectations before anyone else had to ask. That role wasn't assigned in a meeting or spoken out loud. It just formed over time, reinforced by smiles, nods, and the relief on my parents' faces when I didn't push back. My sister, on the other hand, was always framed as needing more. More attention. More reassurance. More resources. Her wants were treated like emergencies, while mine were treated like optional extras. If she asked, the answer was usually yes, or at least let's see how we can make it work. If I asked, the answer came with conditions, delays, or explanations about timing and money. That contrast became normal to us, like gravity pulling in only one direction. There wasn't obvious abuse or cruelty. That's important to say. There were no insults, no shouting matches, no visible favoritism that outsiders would catch immediately. It was subtler than that. It lived in patterns. It lived in who was accommodated first and who was expected to adapt. When you grow up inside that system, it doesn't register as unfair. It just feels like the natural order of things. Money was always the explanation. Not just for the vacation, but for 100 smaller moments that came before it. We can't afford that right now. Let's be practical. You understand, right? And I always did. Or at least I said I did. Even when the numbers didn't quite make sense, I trusted the reasoning because questioning it felt like questioning their competence or love. I started working part-time as soon as I could. I paid for my own clothes, my own outings, my own extras. I told myself it was independence, something to be proud of. And in some ways it was. But it also became proof that I didn't need as much, that I could manage on less. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to create tension. So I kept saying yes, even when what I really felt was quiet resentment mixed with guilt for feeling it. There were moments I almost spoke up. Small ones. Like standing in the kitchen while plans were being discussed without me, or overhearing decisions that affected me secondhand. Each time, I talked myself out of it. I told myself it wasn't worth the awkwardness. I told myself harmony mattered more than honesty. That self-editing became automatic, like breathing. Over time, I internalized the idea that fairness was something you earned by being patient. That if I proved I could handle less, I'd eventually be trusted with more. It never occurred to me that the system itself might be broken. I assumed the problem was timing, or age, or circumstance, not preference. Didn't see how this mindset shaped my reactions until much later. Back then, it felt like maturity. It felt like emotional intelligence. In reality, it was conditioning that rewarded silence and compliance. It taught me to doubt my instincts before anyone else had to. It also taught me to confuse endurance with strength. That confusion followed me into adulthood and relationships, shaping how I minimized myself everywhere. Saying yes slowly became my personality. Yes, that's fine. Yes, I understand. Yes, maybe next time. Friends saw me as easygoing. Teachers saw me as mature. My parents saw me as uncomplicated. What no one saw was how much I was shelving, how many small disappointments I stacked away because I believed that was the cost of being loved without conditions. When my mom explained the ticket situation, it fit perfectly into that identity. Of course I would understand. Of course I wouldn't make it harder. Of course I'd wait my turn. That's why the explanation didn't just sound logical, it sounded familiar. This context matters because it explains my silence. It explains why I didn't argue or demand fairness. I genuinely believed that patience would be rewarded eventually. That if I stayed cooperative long enough, balance would appear on its own. Pause, but patience didn't protect me from what came next. The days leading up to the trip moved strangely fast and painfully slow at the same time. Every time I circled back to the question in my head, my mom gave me the same explanation, delivered with calm certainty. She said flights were expensive, budgets were tight, and choices had to be made. Her tone never changed, which somehow made it feel more final. I nodded along, even when my chest tightened, because consistency sounded like truth. But there were details I wasn't meant to hear. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Phone calls lowered in volume. Once, I overheard talk of a hotel upgrade, said casually, like an afterthought. Another time, I heard my mom mention an activity that definitely wasn't free. Each comment felt like static in my brain, confusing but not loud enough to confront. I told myself I was misinterpreting things. I wanted to believe that more than anything. My sister acted excited, but she avoided my eyes. She talked quickly, jumped topics, and filled silence with noise. When I asked questions, her answers were short, almost rehearsed. It wasn't guilt exactly, but it wasn't ease either. I noticed it and then immediately felt bad for noticing. I told myself she was just nervous about traveling, just distracted, just being herself. Excitement can look strange when you're trying not to show it. The morning they left, I stood in the doorway and waved like everything was normal. I didn't cry. I didn't ask for updates. I told myself I was proud of how mature I was being. Once the house was quiet, that pride faded into something hollow. I spent the first night alone convincing myself solitude was peaceful, not lonely. Then the photos started appearing online. Beaches. Smiling faces. Plates of food that looked expensive. I scrolled slowly, forcing myself to double tap, forcing myself to feel happy for them. I left supportive comments. I sent messages wishing them fun. I played the role I'd practiced my whole life, the one who didn't complicate joy. Every time doubt surfaced, I shut it down. I reminded myself that adults make hard decisions kids don't always understand. I told myself money is complicated, and parents don't owe explanations beyond what they choose to give. I defended my mom internally like she could hear my thoughts. I believed she wouldn't lie about something like finances. That felt too big, too intentional, too cruel. Still, the cracks widened. One photo lingered longer than the others. It showed something that didn't match the budget story at all. I stared at it, zoomed in, zoomed out, feeling my stomach drop. It wasn't flashy, but it was specific. It was proof that something I'd been told simply didn't align with reality. I tried to rationalize it away. Maybe it was a gift. Maybe it was discounted. Maybe I didn't know the full story. But once the question formed, it refused to leave. It sat there, heavy and quiet, waiting for me to acknowledge it. When they came back, everything looked the same at first. The house was where it always was. The routine resumed like nothing unusual had happened. But almost immediately, the story I'd been given started to feel unstable. Not because of one big reveal, but because of small inconsistencies that piled up faster than I could ignore them. Overheard conversations I wasn't part of. Casual mentions of places they ate, things they did, experiences that sounded expensive even without details. There were comments about meals that weren't fast or simple, about activities that required tickets, about little conveniences that add up quickly. Each one quietly contradicted the idea that money had been so tight they could only afford a single plane seat. Souvenirs appeared in unexpected places. Not cheap trinkets, but carefully chosen items that suggested time and money spent thoughtfully. My sister talked about restaurants like she'd memorized the menu, mentioning dishes that didn't come from a budget line. I tried to listen without reacting, but every detail added weight to the question already sitting in my chest. When I finally asked my mom something simple, not accusatory, she answered vaguely and moved on. She talked in circles, offering half explanations that didn't connect. If I followed up, she redirected the conversation or laughed it off. It wasn't anger or defensiveness. It was avoidance. That made it worse. I felt torn between wanting to trust her and feeling increasingly foolish for doing so. There's a specific kind of discomfort that comes from realizing you might be the only one still believing something everyone else has moved past. I replayed the ticket conversation in my head over and over. Each time, it sounded less organic. Less like a difficult truth and more like a prepared answer. The more I noticed, the harder it became to ignore how my sister acted around me. She snapped over small things that never bothered her before. She bristled when I asked harmless questions. There was an edge to her tone, like she was bracing for something I wasn't saying out loud. It made our interactions tense, uneven, like we were having two different conversations at once. I started to realize that information had been shared in a way that excluded me on purpose. Everyone else seemed to know where the lines were, what could be mentioned and what couldn't. I was the only one catching up in real time, piecing things together after the fact. That realization stung more than the money ever could. Disappointment slowly turned into suspicion. I stopped confronting anyone directly and started paying attention instead. I listened. I remembered. I noticed patterns instead of isolated moments. The more I did that, the clearer it became that the truth wasn't hidden particularly well. It was just never meant for me. Then I found something I wasn't meant to see. Curiosity didn't explode into confrontation. It narrowed into focus. I stopped asking questions out loud and started noticing details I'd ignored before. Small things. Phone screens lighting up at odd moments. Envelopes left on counters a little too long. Dates mentioned casually that didn't line up with the story I'd been told. I wasn't snooping or searching. I was simply present in a way I hadn't been before, paying attention without announcing it. One afternoon, a bank notification flashed on my mom's phone while she was busy cooking. It wasn't dramatic or alarming. Just a number and a merchant name that stuck in my head longer than it should have. Later that week, I noticed receipts folded into a drawer, some dated weeks before the trip had even happened. Then I noticed another one. And then another. Each one quietly contradicted the idea that the vacation had been a last-minute decision shaped by financial limits. What hit me hardest wasn't the spending itself. It was the timing. The trip hadn't been a stretch or a scramble. It had been planned. Budgeted. Prepared for carefully. The issue was never whether they could afford 2 tickets. It was who the second ticket was meant for. That realization landed slowly, then all at once, like a room going silent after loud music stops. The emotional shift surprised me. I expected anger or maybe a sense of relief. Instead, I felt clarity, and clarity somehow hurt more than confusion ever had. Hurt has edges you can push against. Clarity just sits there, undeniable and still. It forced me to accept that the explanation I'd been given wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding. It was a deliberate decision made in advance. As I connected the dots, I saw how far back the planning went. Conversations referenced months ago. Deposits already paid. Schedules adjusted quietly without discussion. The lie hadn't been impulsive or reactive. It had been intentional, designed to keep me agreeable, compliant, and out of the way while plans moved forward without resistance. That understanding reframed the entire situation in a way I couldn't undo. Once I accepted that, other memories surfaced. Times I'd been told no for similar reasons. Moments where money was cited as the limit, only for exceptions to appear later when I wasn't involved. I realized how often I'd taken explanations at face value without asking who they benefited. The pattern became obvious, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I also noticed how carefully information was managed around me. Conversations paused when I entered rooms. Details were softened or skipped entirely. It wasn't secrecy out of fear, but convenience. It was easier for them if I stayed uninformed. That realization hurt in a quieter way, because it meant my role hadn't changed at all. I had simply been handled. What I felt then wasn't rage. It was grief. Grief for the trust I'd given freely. Grief for the version of myself that believed honesty was automatic inside a family. Trust doesn't usually shatter in a single moment. It erodes quietly, piece by piece, until one day you notice what's missing and realize it's gone for good. By this point, I knew the truth completely. I knew why I'd been left behind and how carefully it had been orchestrated. What they didn't know was that I knew. I still nodded. I still played my role. But inside, something fundamental had shifted, and that gave me control I never had before. Once I stopped asking questions, everything changed. Silence created space, and in that space, people filled it themselves. I listened in a way I never had before, not just to words but to timing, tone, and what was said when they thought I wasn't paying attention. There's a strange freedom in being underestimated. When people assume you're still fooled, they stop editing themselves. Pause. I didn't record anything. I didn't snoop or dig through private things. I didn't need to. The truth was everywhere once I stopped interrupting it. I remembered dates, places, offhand remarks. I noticed how stories shifted depending on the audience. I kept a mental timeline running quietly in the background, lining up details like puzzle pieces that finally had a picture to belong to. My mom contradicted herself casually one afternoon in front of relatives. She mentioned how long the trip had been planned, then later implied it was rushed. No one challenged her, but I noticed the inconsistency immediately. I watched her adjust mid-sentence, smoothing it over with a laugh. That moment stuck with me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was careless. My sister did something similar, just louder. She bragged about parts of the trip without realizing what she was revealing. She talked about reservations made weeks in advance, about planning around schedules, about how excited she'd been counting down. Each word chipped away at the version of events I'd been given. She wasn't confessing. She was reminiscing. That made it worse. What surprised me was how each new confirmation hurt less than the first. The initial realization had knocked the air out of me. After that, the pain dulled into something manageable. I think my mind adjusted to protect me. I stopped hoping the truth would change. I stopped expecting an explanation that would suddenly make it all reasonable. I accepted what was happening, and that acceptance brought an odd calm. There's a specific moment when betrayal becomes undeniable. It's not loud or cinematic. It's quiet, almost boring. You stop asking why and start asking what now. That's where I found myself. The confusion lifted, replaced by clarity that felt heavy but stable. I wasn't spiraling anymore. I was grounded. I started writing things down privately. Not to build a case against anyone, not to plan confrontation, but to keep myself steady. Memory can blur when emotions run high. Writing gave me something solid to return to when doubt crept back in. It reminded me that I wasn't imagining patterns or exaggerating moments. The facts existed whether anyone acknowledged them or not. As I wrote, I noticed something else shifting. My goal wasn't exposure. I didn't want apologies or public accountability. I wanted safety. Emotional safety. I wanted to stop being the person who absorbed disappointment quietly while everyone else moved on unaffected. Protecting myself became more important than being right. Stopped waiting for fairness. I stopped hoping someone would notice the imbalance and fix it on their own. That hope had kept me stuck longer than the lie ever did. Letting go of it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. Distance stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like peace. By the end of this phase, I wasn't angry. I was resolved. I knew what I was dealing with, and I knew what I needed to do next. I just didn't know how soon it would happen. Then they made one mistake they couldn't undo. The moment it happened wasn't planned. There was no confrontation or dramatic setup. It slipped out accidentally, the way truth sometimes does when people forget who knows what. We were sitting with extended family, the kind of gathering where stories repeat themselves out of habit. My mom was talking casually about the trip when she reached for the explanation she'd used so many times before. She said they couldn't afford 2 tickets. She said it like muscle memory. What she didn't realize was that the person she was speaking to already knew otherwise. I saw it register on their face instantly. Confusion flickered first, then hesitation, then something like restraint. They didn't call her out. They didn't interrupt. They just stopped nodding. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. No one jumped in to help her. No one corrected the story or smoothed it over. The lie just hung there, unsupported, suddenly fragile. I watched my mom realize it mid-sentence. Her voice slowed. She added unnecessary details, then contradicted herself slightly, trying to patch the moment before it fell apart completely. It didn't work. My sister froze. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. Her posture stiffened, her expression flattening as she looked around the room. She understood immediately what was happening. The version of events they'd controlled so carefully had stepped outside the space where it was protected. It was exposed to people who weren't invested in maintaining it. I stayed quiet. I didn't look at anyone. I didn't react. I let the discomfort exist without trying to fix it. For once, I didn't rush to make things easier. That silence said more than any accusation ever could have. It forced everyone to sit with the inconsistency instead of brushing past it. Pause. In that moment, something subtle shifted. The power dynamic changed without a single word from me. For the first time, I wasn't the only one holding the truth privately. I wasn't the only one carrying the weight of knowing something was wrong. The lie had escaped the small, controlled environment it was built in, and outside of that space, it couldn't survive intact. Once a lie goes public, even briefly, it loses its stability. It can't be adjusted as easily. It can't be explained away without scrutiny. I saw that realization hit my mom slowly, like a delayed reaction. She moved on to another topic too quickly, her energy tight and forced. The conversation continued, but something had changed underneath it. The aftermath wasn't loud. It was tense. Conversations felt clipped. Eye contact was avoided. My sister stayed unusually quiet, no longer bragging or filling space. My mom hovered, overly attentive, checking in on me in ways she hadn't before. It was subtle, but it was there. The atmosphere felt like everyone was recalculating their positions. Later, when it was just us again, no one mentioned what had happened. There were no apologies or explanations. But the silence wasn't the same as before. It carried awareness. They knew the story wasn't airtight anymore. They knew I wasn't isolated with the truth. For the first time, I felt them watching me carefully, not with authority, but with caution. They didn't know what I might say next or who I might say it to. That uncertainty made them nervous. That fear changed how they treated me overnight. I stopped chasing explanations once I realized they would never give me one that felt honest. There was no final conversation where everything was laid out cleanly. Instead, something quieter happened. I began creating boundaries without announcing them. I didn't make speeches or set ultimatums. I just changed how available I was. That shift felt strange at first, like stepping out of character in a play everyone else was still performing. I pulled back emotionally in small, deliberate ways. I stopped volunteering details about my life. I stopped filling silence with reassurance. I stopped being the first to offer help when something went wrong. It wasn't done out of spite. It was done out of exhaustion. I realized how much energy I'd been pouring into keeping things smooth while my own discomfort stayed unresolved. Also stopped offering money, favors, and emotional labor automatically. For years, I'd said yes before even checking in with myself. This time, I paused. Sometimes I declined politely. Sometimes I simply wasn't available. Each time I chose myself, a small knot of anxiety loosened. I didn't explain my reasons, because I no longer felt the need to justify protecting my peace. My mom noticed the change almost immediately. She asked if something was wrong, not with concern, but with confusion. When that didn't pull me back in, she tried guilt instead. She reminded me of everything she'd done for me. She implied I was being distant, ungrateful, different. I listened without reacting. I didn't argue or defend myself. I didn't offer reassurance. I let the discomfort exist without rushing to fix it. That restraint was new for me. In the past, I would have folded quickly, explained myself, tried to make her understand. This time, I didn't. I realized that explaining only invited negotiation, and I was done negotiating my boundaries. Silence became my response, not as punishment, but as clarity. I redirected my focus toward work and independence. I invested time in building a life that didn't rely on their approval or validation. I worked longer hours. I saved money. I created routines that felt grounding. The more stable my own world became, the less power their opinions held over me. That stability felt unfamiliar, but deeply relieving. Accepting that love in that house had conditions was painful. It meant letting go of the hope that things would eventually balance out if I just waited longer. That hope had kept me tethered to disappointment. Once I released it, I felt grief, but also freedom. I stopped measuring my worth by how useful or agreeable I was. Peace replaced anxiety gradually, not all at once. There were days I second-guessed myself, wondering if I was being too harsh or selfish. But every time I considered going back to how things were, my body reacted first. Tension returned. My chest tightened. That response reminded me why I'd changed. Walking away didn't look dramatic. There were no slammed doors or final arguments. It looked like quiet consistency. It looked like fewer calls returned. It looked like shorter visits. It looked like choosing rest over obligation. That consistency protected me more than any confrontation ever could have. This decision wasn't punishment. It wasn't revenge. It was self-respect. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I was trying to live honestly without shrinking myself to fit someone else's comfort. They didn't realize what they lost until it was gone. The consequences didn't come from anything I said or did directly. That's what surprised me most. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't confront them publicly. I didn't tell extended family my side of the story. I simply stepped back and let time do what it always does when stories don't line up. The outcomes unfolded on their own, quietly and steadily, driven entirely by their behavior. As weeks passed, family members started noticing inconsistencies in other stories too. Not just about the vacation, but about finances, plans, and past events. Small questions surfaced in casual conversations. Someone would pause, then ask for clarification. Someone else would remember things differently. Each moment was subtle, but together they created doubt that couldn't be dismissed easily. Trust erodes in ways you can't control once people sense a pattern. It doesn't shatter dramatically. It thins. It weakens. It becomes conditional. I watched that happen from a distance, noticing how people listened differently to my mom now. They nodded less. They asked follow-up questions. They compared notes afterward. The authority her explanations once carried began to fade. My sister felt it too. Support she'd always assumed would be there became hesitant. Invitations slowed. Excitement around her stories dulled. People didn't challenge her openly, but they stopped celebrating her the same way. Once others saw the pattern of priority and exclusion, it became harder to ignore. Her confidence shifted into defensiveness, and that change didn't go unnoticed. My mom tried to rewrite history. She softened timelines. She reframed decisions. She claimed misunderstandings. But the more she adjusted the story, the harder it became to keep it consistent. Dates blurred. Details changed. Explanations contradicted each other depending on who she was speaking to. Watching that happen was strangely sobering. It wasn't malicious so much as desperate. Instead of accountability, they blamed stress. They blamed miscommunication. They blamed how busy everyone had been. Nothing was ever intentional, according to them. Everything was accidental. That refusal to acknowledge impact only deepened the distance others felt. People don't expect perfection, but they do notice when responsibility is always avoided. My absence made the imbalance clearer than any argument could have. Without me quietly compensating, gaps appeared. No one stepped in the same way. No one smoothed things over. The dynamic shifted because the stabilizing force was gone. That absence wasn't loud, but it was revealing. It showed how much I'd been absorbing without recognition. Karma didn't look like punishment or revenge. It looked like natural consequences. Relationships cooled. Trust diminished. Stories lost their power. It was slow and unsatisfying in a dramatic sense, but deeply validating on a personal one. Nothing about it felt cruel. It felt inevitable. For the first time, I watched all of this from a place of emotional safety. I wasn't bracing myself or anticipating fallout. I wasn't trying to fix anything. I observed without anxiety, without guilt, without responsibility for outcomes that were never mine to manage. That distance gave me clarity I'd never had before. Realized then that stepping back hadn't destroyed the family dynamic. It had simply stopped protecting it from the truth. What fell apart afterward was never stable to begin with. I didn't feel triumph. I felt acceptance. Some lessons don't arrive with drama. They arrive with quiet confirmation that you made the right choice. Then came the call I never expected. The final conversation didn't arrive with apologies or emotional speeches. It came quietly, framed as a request to return to how things used to be. My mom talked about how distant everything felt now, how disconnected we'd become. She didn't mention the lie. She didn't acknowledge the imbalance. She spoke as if time alone had caused the shift, as if restoring normalcy was just a matter of effort. I listened carefully and realized something important. She wasn't asking how I felt. She was asking for access. She wanted the version of me that absorbed discomfort without complaint. The version that smoothed things over and filled the gaps. I declined calmly. I didn't bring up the vacation or list grievances. I simply said I wasn't comfortable going back to how things were. That was the moment I understood that closure doesn't always involve confession or remorse. Sometimes it's a quiet acceptance that the other person isn't willing or able to meet you where you are. I didn't need her to admit anything for my decision to be valid. I didn't need agreement to move forward. I just needed to honor what I knew to be true. Accepting that some people love you in ways that still harm you was one of the hardest lessons. Love doesn't always come with care or fairness built in. Sometimes it comes with expectations, conditions, and blind spots that never get addressed. Understanding that helped me stop personalizing the behavior. It wasn't that I was unworthy of honesty. It was that honesty wasn't convenient. Also learned that fairness isn't something you earn by being patient. Waiting quietly doesn't guarantee balance. Endurance doesn't inspire change on its own. I spent years believing that if I proved how understanding I was, things would eventually even out. They didn't. That belief cost me time, energy, and trust I'll never fully get back. Believing people without evidence can cost you years. I don't say that with bitterness, but with clarity. Trust is powerful, but blind trust is expensive. I learned to listen to patterns instead of promises, to notice actions instead of explanations. That shift reshaped how I approach every relationship in my life, not just family ones. Setting boundaries stopped feeling selfish once I saw how much damage came from not having them. I became more intentional about what I give, when I give, and to whom. I stopped measuring my value by how much I could sacrifice. Love, I learned, shouldn't require you to disappear or accept less to keep the peace. This experience changed how I show up everywhere. At work. In friendships. In future relationships. I check in with myself before saying yes. I allow discomfort instead of rushing to fix it. I trust my instincts when something feels off, even if I can't explain it immediately. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, I want you to think about the quiet lies you accepted because you trusted the source. The moments you dismissed your own doubt because questioning felt wrong or disloyal. Ask yourself what that patience has cost you, and whether it's truly protecting anyone. Believing yourself is sometimes the bravest choice you can make. So here's the question you should ask yourself.